Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and I'm joined today by Sean Gorman. Now, Sean is a Land Rover instructor. He plans a lot of Land Rover's big expeditions. He plans the Defender Trophy. He plans the Trek events. He also does training and event coordination for other manufacturers. He has a deep well of experience as an instructor and as a traveler. Sean has also scaled big mountains, so he's used to big mountain expedition planning as well. Sean and I did have an interview with him several podcasts ago, but this particular podcast is around the principles of overlanding driving. So Sean and I do the deep dive into driving in sand, driving in rocks, and driving in mud. So Sean and I do the deep dive into driving in sand, driving in rocks, and driving in mud. We also spend some time talking about what you need to do before you leave for a trip, kind of how to set up the vehicle to be as supportive for the driver as possible, some basic considerations around modifications. But this entire conversation really focuses on the art of driving. We don't go into a lot of high-speed driving techniques because that's something we're going to cover in a future episode. But for this one, I think it's a great conversation. Sean has a lot of really valuable insights. So please enjoy our principles of overlanding driving. I want to take a moment for a special announcement of our newest video series on the Expedition Portal YouTube channel that features exploring the Smoky Mountains and the East Coast. This multi-part series is presented by Hankook Tires and is hosted by renowned explorer and photographer Sinway Xavier. This series will start at the end of September and run through all of October, featuring a Trail Scout episode, a Jeep Gladiator feature vehicle, trip planning and preparation, and some installments showing the local artisans and places to visit around the Smoky Mountains. We appreciate Hankook's ongoing support of the Overland community and this podcast. Sean, thanks for being on the podcast with us today.
Pleasure.
So we're going to talk through the principles of overlanding driving, because it's something, when we're on a long trip, we have a vehicle that's kind of set up to be not a master of any one terrain, unless the expedition is very specific to a type of terrain, like if you're in the high latitudes, then you've got something with huge flotation tires, but then that vehicle wouldn't be appropriate for driving through a colonial village in Central America. So we typically have overland vehicles that are, a jack of all trades, but a master of none. So it's good to talk through driving techniques that can help us to maximize the performance of these near stock, often heavily loaded expedition vehicles. And I think that you're the perfect person to do this conversation with me because of your experience with Land Rovers. You've also led huge expeditions in the mountaineering world, even on Everest. So you have this understanding of that I need to be as light as possible, but I also have some safety considerations, which no doubt you learned in the mountains. So thanks for spending the time with me today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first thing that I thought we would chat about is what mindset we need to have, and what are some of the things that we need to do before we even leave the house.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. So you brought up the mountaineering thing up early. So I think it actually translates really well, because from a mountaineering side, if you told somebody that you're going to go climb a big peak, they would instantly go into two different stages of preparation. One step of preparation would be to prepare themselves, like their body, their fitness, their ability to be able to handle altitudes. You're not going to find somebody who's going to go climb a big mountain and probably hanging out and eating potato chips all day for the months ahead of time. There's this preparation of getting themselves mentally and physically prepared for it.
Yeah, sure.
Well, that also translates to a vehicle expedition, because even though you're in a car all day, the reality of it is that being in a car all day there's a certain amount of physical fitness and physicality that comes with it, because it's a sedentary position that you're in, but it's not a sedentary role. Your body is moving all the time, and your neck starts to hurt, and you realize that you have a big head, and all these sort of things. You the same way your boots start to bother you after days of walking in it. You start to notice all the little spots in the cars, and why didn't they build the armrest a little thicker, or why didn't they put a little more padding here, or why is this seat so narrow? And
I've also found that it's like interrupted by periods of fairly intense physicality, like when you're loading and unloading a vehicle, when you're running a vehicle recovery. The number of times that I've seen people in the wild or in the terrain, and they're needing to just pull that 60, 70 feet of winch cable out, and they're smoked.
Yeah, you get totally gassed.
Because
like hot,
that's right.
And stuff,
it's usually hot. It's usually in the middle of the day. Usually they're amped up because they got stuck.
Yeah.
And they didn't take a second to kind of calm things down. You know, they're pretty focused, like parasympathetically. They're really just like in that moment. They're not really thinking about how they're feeling, and giving it a minute just to start to collaborate around that. So one of the things that I do think is important is some physical fitness. You need to be able to move. You need to be able to lift heavy bags, get max tracks off the roof, dig out with a shovel. I mean, you and I have done that. I mean, even when we were in the Coral Peak sand dunes with those Land Rovers and we did some digging, like I was feeling it, and because, we were doing a lot of digging.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, that's a really good, like, driving in the sand is a good way to get yourself mentally in a position to realize that maybe there's improvement in driving skill.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can do everything right and you still get stuck.
Mm-hmm.
So you realize that, especially in hot places, when you're in the desert and things, that the more you get stuck, the more difficult it is on your body. And there is this sort of finite amount of times you can do that before you're just done.
That's right.
So yeah, driving skill is important that way.
And we'll talk about that in sand. But the reality is that you're most likely to get stuck when it's the hottest.
Correct.
Because then the silica has heated up, the air has expanded between the silica, so it's actually has the least amount of weight bearing. So you're even more likely to get stuck in the heat of the day, and also usually the sun is directly overhead. So you don't have the good shadowing of the terrain to judge the best line.
Can't see very well.
You're not judging the best line. So you take a bad line, sand is super soft, you're done, and you're stuck. So yeah, you're right. It's much like mountaineering.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other part to mountaineering is like, so you have this sort of physical part, but then you also have this kind of gear side, which is people are going to be really conscientious about what they're going to take, what they're going to carry, what makes them comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this real fine line, because a lot of times you're carrying all your own stuff.
Yeah.
Of what's the kind of value proposition.
Sure.
Does this make me feel really good? So maybe it's worth carrying. But if it doesn't really provide any value, why are you carrying it?
Yeah.
And because that affects you directly physically, it's really relevant.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I actually think that's very relevant to an expedition too. Is that you have a limited amount of space. Oftentimes you have more space than you have load capacity. So, you don't want to just because there's an empty spot, fill it with something because there's room for it. And of course, the fun thing also on expedition trips is that when you do have a little space, it gives you a little space to like buy things and bring them back with you and stuff, right?
Yeah, like I brought back a wooden Land Rover from Africa. You got a little you get a little bit of space. Yeah, but and payload also makes a huge difference in how the vehicle performs. So just because we have a gross vehicle weight, especially on like a 1-ton full-size pickup, just because we have that payload doesn't mean that we should use it.
Yeah.
The lighter the vehicle is, the better it will perform in nearly every scenario. And it'll certainly be less likely to break.
Yep.
Your reliability will improve, your fuel consumption will improve, which means you can carry less fuel. So it all propagates the problem once the vehicle starts to get very heavy. And that's certainly part of proper planning before we go. We need to bring the things that we need to bring along, but let's minimize the equipment. Like, don't bring the kettlebells, It's like, use a pulley block as a kettlebell or something. Use something else.
You got something else heavy enough.
Flip a spare tire for about 10 minutes and you'll have a pretty good workout. So I think, making sure that the vehicle is light. I'm also a big fan of a thorough inspection before you leave. If you don't feel comfortable properly inspecting a vehicle and inspecting your toolkit and your spares kit, then take it to a trusted mechanic or find someone in your local club that has that experience that can help you do an inspection before you leave for the trip.
Yeah, knowing what the condition of the car is quite important. And I got a couple airplanes and doing a pre-flight.
Yeah, it's
kind of important, right?
It's
so
a pre-flight.
You want to make sure. The idea of a pre-flight on a plane isn't necessarily to make sure that the plane is perfect. It's that as a pilot, you're confident that the condition that it's in is airworthy, that you're in a position that you feel comfortable to fly it in whatever your mission is. And really, it's the same with the car, right? So it's not that the car has to be 100%.
Yeah.
It's that you know exactly what you're starting with and what the car should do, right? Like what that functionality should be. And so, we, even on a fleet side, so like when I do, especially on expedition type trips, but even do a ride and drive every single day, every single car should be looked at and checked. It's part of what, I'm always a fan of trying to keep a clean car.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons...
then you can see what's wrong with it.
That's right. If you have this really filthy, nasty, dirty car, not only is it harder on the car, everything creates friction and you don't know what's going, but it masks things. It masks oil leaks and it also becomes a problem when you do have to do a trail fix.
Yeah.
Like the messier it is, the worse it is, the harder to keep clean it is. And so
and if the paint is that dirty and muddy, so is the radiator.
Yeah.
So are the intercoolers, which are more and more common now.
Especially down low, right? Where, we're going to get where that free flowing air. And so it's part of our job to really look at stuff. And also I think it's a really good idea, particularly on an expedition type trip, is when you do just a walk around. And the walk around is something as simple as looking at the tires, popping the hood. Yep. Check the oil's great and check the fluids and all that kind of stuff. But the reality of it is what you're trying to do is just to make sure you know what you expect it to be. Taking a look at it. And we did a trip a few years ago. We woke up and the car had a flat tire. And honestly, it would have been an easy spot for us to just not have noticed until we started to drive away. Then, of course, you drive away and you drive 10 feet and go, I have a flat tire. And then you unload everything because, while you're prepared for a flat, it's always a pain in the neck.
Right, because all the gears back in there and everything. Yeah, sure.
So now you're 2 hours behind. So then the rest of the day is to try to make up the 2 hours, to try to beat the daylight to get to the next spot.
Which just increases the likelihood that another issue will come up.
Correct. Yeah, it's always that. Right, accidents and injuries usually caused by chain of events.
Yep.
A bunch of small things that happen to create a position for something to go wrong.
Yeah, I would agree.
This is a perfect example of that. So take the 5 minutes, walk around the car, maybe before you load it up, have a look at it. Another thing is just being aware when you're driving it. The beauty of, I think, having a car that's really functional daily and also being able to go off-road and have fun with is that the more time you're in it, the more you start to understand the sounds, the smells, the squeaks and the rattles, what's normal, what's not normal, so that when you're off-road and all of a sudden you start to hear something that sounds like a little grinding or maybe you get a little jounce in the suspension and all of a sudden you hear some scraping and you're like, I don't normally hear that. It instantly means that you're aware enough of what the car is doing to start to get some awareness on what's happening, because the best decision would be is that you hear something, you stop, you check it, there's a problem, and then you can modify the trip. But if you don't realize it and you just keep going through the process, this is how people end up stuck in the middle of nowhere.
Well, and also the advantage of daily driving your overland vehicle is that you pull it into parking spots every day. You get the muscle memory is very precise. I notice that when people drive their dailies on the trail, they're so much more smooth. Their inputs are much more precise. They're better able to modulate the clutch or the brake or the throttle. Because if you just hop into your overland vehicle twice a year, you've got a whole new learning curve that you need to address. And it's not saying that one is better than the other, but that's one of the advantages of daily driving your adventure vehicle too.
Well, I say that one of the hard things is that I think a lot of people operate vehicles. They don't ever really learn to drive them. They just learn the operations. If I turn the steering wheel to the right, it turns right. There's no idea of how much and when and how's that actually translating to the ground.
Sure.
So when I turn it to the right and I'm now going straight still, I'm still turning to the right and I'm still going straight. So I keep turning it to the right and there's no ta-da, I'm asking it to do something and it's not happening. So why am I continuing to perpetuate the behavior? You know?
But that happens for sure. All right. So then the other thing that we need to look at around preparing before we even go, and I'm a big proponent of it, is training. So manufacturers provide training. Ford has training courses. Land Rover has training courses. A lot of times when you buy a new vehicle, you can get a training class that comes with the car. Otherwise, there's a couple ways to go about it. You can go to like an Overland Expo where training, it's at a very high level, but it's also, and what I mean by that is it doesn't go down into the details very much, but it's very affordable. So there's opportunities for training around events like the Overland Expo. And then also there's your local clubs. So finding other Overlanders that have some experience, you can learn quite a bit from traveling with those who have a few miles under their belt. And then, of course, the most expensive, but also the most effective option is to find a trainer that is experienced in overlanding that can help you drive your vehicle. The reason why I say experienced in overlanding is there are a lot of very good four-wheel drive trainers, but many of them lack the experience of traveling internationally. So, and it doesn't mean that they're going to tell you something wrong, but oftentimes they have some blind spots. So, for example, there are countries where tire sizes are limited. So a four-wheel drive trainer might say, you know what, you could fit 35s on that Jeep. But if you take that Jeep to Australia with 35s, it's now illegal on the road. Or they may recommend things that start to push payload. And again, in Australia, they actually have random gross vehicle weight checks on cars in Australia. You're driving down the Oodnada track and here's a bunch of police officers and they'll pull you over and put you on a scale. And if you're over gross vehicle weight, it graduates up to the fact that they will even impound your car. So those are things that many four-wheel drive instructors won't know. And they also may have an emphasis towards recreational driving, which that's the difference between overlanding and four-wheeling. Four-wheeling is sport, recreational sport, which I love. I love going four-wheeling for the day. There's nothing more fun than that. But overlanding is travel, which means that we have a totally different mindset. We're going to actually look for the easiest line in many cases. We're going to have the most mechanical sympathy. We're going to default more towards using a winch earlier, engaging lockers earlier, airing down earlier, so that way we're minimizing the impact of the vehicle. So I feel trainers like yourself who have extensive international travel experience are the kinds of folks that people need to be looking for when they want to learn about overland driving.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a different thing. You know, we're trying to teach people kind of the basic skills, and of course it's different with everybody. But in general, I would say, 95% of the people that come in, even ones who are great drivers, are still really nervous about things like, what are normal sounds? What does traction control sound like? What does it sound like when the car is working properly? I think one of the advantages of having a more stock vehicle versus a heavily modified one is that anytime you have a heavily modified vehicle, you have a tendency to want to prove to yourself that the expenditure was worth the cost, meaning that you start to push the limits because you want to see it. And you see it all the time on the trail, right? You see something that's really nicely built and they're trying to crawl up some kind of really big rock flex because they want to see if their $10,000 suspension and shock package that they bought really has that much travel in it. And it's one thing just sort of screwing around on a weekend, but it's a real different thing if you're talking about taking a month off of work and driving around the Southwest or heading down into Baja or something. Like there's a time and place for things, and during a trip is not the time to see. The whole idea is that you go through the whole trip and you never notice the car. If everything works right, you didn't really notice the engine, you didn't really notice the transmission, you didn't really notice that your suspension was awesome because it was just awesome. And when you get done, you're like, it was a great trip. Not, well, I think I need to have bigger tires and I need to...
And the vehicle was well suited to the trip and everything else. And the other thing too, and it's often overlooked, is when you go get training, bring your primary travel partner with you. It's one of the most common sources of arguments and frustrations on travels. also the reality on a long trip is that the primary driver can get sick or injured.
Yeah.
So imagine if you fall off the roof rack and now you've got a broken ankle at your right ankle, and you're driving a left-hand drive, and you're like, it's really, really going to be hard to drive with your left foot.
Yeah.
So having your travel companion competent in marshaling, spotting through terrain, having your travel companion comfortable and competent driving off-road, driving the vehicle in technical terrain, it's going to pay huge dividends, and it's also going to get your travel companion more excited about doing it. They're going to have a good time.
Yeah.
So it does add a little bit of expense, but sometimes you can negotiate that with a four-wheel drive trainer.
Sure.
Hey, we're both showing up in the same car. Can you give me any kind of a discount?
Yeah.
And usually they'll do that.
I think if they're a good trainer, they should emphasize it.
Yeah,
because the reality is, especially if you're a couple.
Yeah.
Learning how to do this together is a little bit like couples therapy, because there's a huge trust factor involved here. Typically, what I see is like a guy comes in with his car and brings his girlfriend, and at the end of the day, he wants to drive his car.
Yeah.
But the terrain means that you need to be able to trust her, to be able to spot, to be able to say something's not right. Or to say like, hey, you gotta be gentler. You're gonna have to drive this. This is really tight. Like you're gonna have to be smooth. You're gonna have to be able to open those lines of communication.
Yes.
So there's a lot of truth to that, because the reality is if you have one person who has a skill set that is required for a trip, if they go down, the trip is over.
Yeah, especially medical. So you got to get cross training. You got to have people on the trip. Maybe you got a woofer, a wilderness first responder on a trip. But the other person better be at least a WUFA. Make sure they got 2 days in a wilderness first aid course. Make sure at a minimum they've taken CPR and basic first aid. Show them where the medical kit is. Show them what the contents of the kit is. Show them how to use the sat phone.
Right.
Show them the number to telemedicine.
Yeah.
So that way, if something goes wrong, they have
know
the
what
ability.
to do.
Yeah, and it's our responsibility as the leader of a trip or as the primary driver. It is our responsibility to educate the other people in the car so that they're safe. Because if the primary driver goes down, which happens, people get sick.
Yeah.
And you got to make the ferry or whatever.
Right.
You better make sure that your travel companion can do all this stuff.
You don't know how many times I have seen people go out, buy a roof tent. They plan a big trip. It's usually like down to Baja or something, right? Big trip. They bought their new roof tent, and in the first week, the guy falls out of the roof tent. It's inevitably, it's always the guy that falls out of the roof tent and he breaks his leg, sprains his ankle.
Margaritas.
Yeah, well, I think usually what it is, it's like they just spend a bunch of money and they're like worried that their tent's going to get broke or something. Yeah. So they want to be the guy who goes up and down the ladder and brings everything in out of the tent, right? And they slip and fall, and either they have to cancel their trip or they have to do the ego check of sitting passenger the whole time, and their girlfriend or wife ended up driving the whole trip anyway. Yeah. So you're absolutely right in that. It's kind of part of a briefing, isn't it? Like it's important that everybody on a trip understands what you're doing, what the risks are, where those sort of inherent risks are, how you mitigate them.
That's right.
And if something does go wrong, what are your points of contact or places to go?
Absolutely. All right. So that covers all of the pre-trip stuff. Now, when you're going out that day, that's when you're doing your quick inspection of the vehicle, looking for fluids leaking, looking for shocks hanging down, looking for low tires, because maybe you picked up a nail or something on the drive in. But you also want to make sure that you've addressed ergonomics in the vehicle. Get the driver's seat, get yourself in a position to maximize your ability to see the trail and to handle the vehicle properly. A lot of new vehicles, which is really cool, have the ability to raise and lower the driver's seat.
Yeah.
So like you might be in like full chill mode, in your Tesla auto driving to work, but when you're driving your Overland vehicle, you want to raise that seat up a little bit, not so high that you could come in contact with the ceiling under a G out or an emergency event, but you want to get pretty high up so you can see more of the trail. You also want to know, usually a vehicle, the leading lines of the hood, if the vehicle was designed properly, should give you indication of where the tires are, where the center point of the tread is. So like on a Land Rover or on a Jeep, on Grenadier, on classic vehicles, you'll be able to see that front fender, or at least a style line in the front fender, to give you an indication where that tire is.
Yep.
So get comfortable with where's the locker switch? Where's the sway bar disconnect switch? Where's the vehicle stability control off switch, which we're going to talk about when it comes to sand driving. So knowing where all that stuff is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things usually when I just get into a car with the first time with people is, you're right, you get them in, I usually tell them to try to sit a bit higher and a bit kind of more upright than they would typically sit.
Sure.
Especially these days, people sit really reclined.
Yep.
And the whole thing is, like, if I am in a car with somebody and I'm really seeing them strain a lot, right? Usually typically see them kind of straining, trying to see up and over the hood.
Yep.
And there's space there. Almost always there's space. I mean, I'm 6'7". I'm one of the few guys that probably
you don't need to raise
have
the
a
seats,
limited amount of space. But
you don't have to raise the seats.
You know, like, I get them to go up, to go forward, to get the steering wheel in nice and tight. I try to make sure that they're the right distance, but also, like, in a position so when their hands are on the wheel, that the weight is more in the palm of the hand versus like trying to hold the steering wheel with their fingers all day.
Yep. And having leverage. The more that the seat is reclined, the less leverage. The more you're using your shoulders as opposed to the major leverage point, like in your elbows. And you also lose a little bit of dexterity and control. You know, like you and I always reinforce to people, as much as possible, you're going to be driving with two hands on the wheel. When you're going higher speed, you will wrap your hands around the wheel, or at least start to wrap your hands around the wheel. At low speed, you're going to take your thumbs around the wheel and you're going to place them on the sides of the wheel. So that way, if you hit a rock hard or something like that, or in a rut, the steering wheel gets jerked out of your hand, you don't end up breaking a thumb. That was very true years ago. I mean, like
it's less so now, yeah.
My FJ40 did try to kill me on a regular basis, even with the thumb not wrapped around the wheel. But most modern four-wheel drives have a lot of anti-kickback. Some of them are even now electronic steering, or they have electronic pumps. And there's much, much less than that. But you still want to be in a good habit, because you never know when you might have to drive somebody's old Willys or 70 series or whatever. So get in the habit of doing that. And another reason why we do that is that we shuffle the wheel when we're off-road. So when we're in very, very tight controlled situations and we're trying to provide a lot of steering precision, we don't want to be hand over hand with the wheel. We want to be maintaining constant contact with the wheel, multiple points of contact, so that way it is less likely to slip off of a rock, or the wheel is less likely to roll on a rock and put us in the wrong position.
Yeah, so we want to drive real precisely, right?
Yeah.
So whenever we want to drive precisely, it means that as a driver, we have to give it real precise inputs.
Yeah.
So if we find ourselves giving it big, over-exaggerated inputs, we should expect over-exaggerated output from the car.
Right.
So any time that we're typically driving precise, which is in the U.S., that's most of the off-road driving that we do. We're looking for precise driving. The last thing we want is these big inputs that ask for the car to do lots of stuff. The more we ask of the car to do, the more difficult it is for it, no matter what the car is.
Especially in sand. I mean, you see big, huge steering inputs in sand, and you're just you're scrubbing so much speed.
Yep.
You're making it so difficult for the car to make it through the turn. Usually in a sand dune, you got enough room. Plan ahead and do a big, we'll talk about that in a second, but, you know, like to your point, the further we plan ahead our inputs, the more likely they are to be smooth and precise.
Yeah, exactly. And learning, you start to hit it a little bit, is understanding where that car is in space, kind of where it is around you. Like, you know, so once we get in the car and we know where our body is comfortable in it, it's really important also for us to know, like, where the differentials are, where the low spots are. The things we typically see are, if you're going to damage a car, it's almost always the passenger rear.
That's right.
And that's the part everybody
passenger
forgets.
Rear tire is the first thing to get
first flat
damaged. Right? Yeah, that's right.
So, you know, things like that. And we can mitigate some of that stuff, like aiming our mirrors down at those back tires.
Mm-hmm. We
don't need to see if there's traffic next to us typically on a trail. So we can use those mirrors to see what we want to see, like where back tires are, where the back of the car is. The other thing is, like, especially these days, is it used to be pretty consistent where we would know where the tire was, at least in front of us, right? Like, you kind of knew if you sat there that the center, or at least the inside of the tire, would be more or less lined up with the clutch pedal or your left foot.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's not so much the case now.
No.
Because we just keep getting wider and wider stances.
Right.
And that is, I think, really relevant because I was just in a Trailmaster Tacoma.
Yeah.
It has a very wide stance, much wider than the previous Tacomas. And if you don't realize that your left foot, when it's at rest in its rest position, is really on the inside of the tire, you're going to be off the trail all the time. And of course, the more we're off the trail, not only does it cause trail damage, but it causes vehicle damage.
And the likelihood of a flat and everything else.
And anytime we have a car that's on the wide side, means that we have to drive it more precisely. Doesn't matter how good the car is. If you drive it into a tree or a giant rock, it will break.
Yeah, and it was interesting, like driving the Bronco Raptor is a good example of that. I mean, this thing is double locked, 37s, sway bar disconnects, but it is as wide as a full-size truck.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Even though, fortunately, it's a shorter wheelbase and the body is fairly narrow, thank goodness, but that is a big vehicle. You really got to pay attention. Absolutely. Well, let's pivot to sand driving, because I think it's one of the things that people have the least opportunity to learn. And it, especially on motorcycles, but certainly in four-wheel drives, it's very intimidating to people. That and mud can be very intimidating to people because there's a lot more speed involved and a lot more unpredictability about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So what are some, you're one of the best sand drivers I've seen. You tell a great story about going out in a new Defender with a four-wheel drive instructor that had limited experience in the sand. And even though he was experienced in a lot of other areas, he gets stuck and he just thought he was done.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a second, let's try something else. So talk a little bit about how you solve that problem. And it's an important reminder that you still have a couple arrows in the quiver.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with sand, so I would say sand is probably one of the most difficult things to drive in.
Yeah.
And that's because it's probably the most dynamic surface to drive in.
Sure.
It's changing constantly. You mentioned sort of time of day and temperature and what side of the wind is it on, and are you upwind or downwind? And
was there a little rain yesterday? Or had
is
it
it
not
humid?
rained? Yeah.
I mean, are you the third car in the pack? Are you in someplace narrow? I mean, sand is crazy, right?
I love it.
Well, that's what makes it fun.
It's a chess match.
Yeah.
Much like snow.
The other thing about sand is that it is unequivocally the most difficult thing for a vehicle to do. Sand for a vehicle. I mean, really, if we looked at it on an engineering level and we really looked at the tire aspect to the sand itself, it's like it's driving up a 60% hill all the time.
Yeah.
It's very hard on the transmission. It's very hard on the and on the engine, and because the line of being able to do it well and to do it poorly is with quite a narrow margin. Yeah. You're never exactly sure where you're at in those sort of thresholds. Now, there are some tricks we can do. Obviously, in sand, airing down is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the challenges I had with my job, I guess I should backtrack a little bit, was I've done a lot of testing with Land Rover in the Middle East, and the testing that we do there primarily is thermal. Some of it's slip control systems, so like trying to make terrain response and those systems work better. But the challenge there is almost everything we do is at max gross vehicle weight.
Yeah.
So, and full tire pressure. So if you can imagine like taking a modern Range Rover on 23s, which are not inherently fantastic, even deflated, maxing it out at gross vehicle weight, and then trying to go run a test routine multiple times so that you can duplicate problems, hopefully not have any problems, but that's sort of the day-to-day life of it. So you become very good at sand driving because as soon as you're stuck, the test is no longer a valid test.
Right.
And so when you're trying to do that 10 times and you have 8 days to do it in, it's vital that you're able to drive a course. And I say a course, it's not really a course, it's a route. It's not like it's not
a closed course.
No, it's out in the dunes, and we do the same thing every time. It's a sign-off course, but it's real terrain. But to be able to duplicate that over and over is quite important. So you become good at it because your job it's imperative to being able to do the work.
Sure.
So when I look at sand, you have to, there's so much to learn about it. It's a super dynamic surface. It's soft. It's almost like a liquid in one sense, right? It looks, if you looked across sand dunes, it looks like an ocean.
Yeah, it is fluid.
But at the same standpoint, if you punched sand, it would hurt your hand.
Right.
It becomes a solid when it's compressed quickly, which is kind of actually what we're doing in a car, is that we're trying to get the speed of the tire right so that when it impacts the surface of the sand, it wants to become a solid.
Right.
And with experience, not only I can almost hear it better than I can feel it in a way. Like I can hear when the car is kind of up on a plane and I'm at the right speed, because as soon as I give it a little more throttle, I start to dig. If I back off, I start to get a lot of drag. Mm-hmm. But that's part of driving it. Now in modern cars, a lot of them have a lot of good information. So one of the things, particularly like in a Land Rover, is that you have this 4x4 info screen. You have these 4 images that basically depict slip.
Sure.
So it has this kind of really rudimentary green, yellow, red thing going on. And it's each wheel, and it shows it. What you'll notice in those cars is when you're just right, you're in the yellow all the time. Like you can almost teach somebody to drive in sand, to teach them the sound and the feel.
Sure.
Is I can get them up on a plane.
Right.
And go, just keep giving it throttle until you're in the yellow, and then just hold it. Because that's that driving skill thing again. Is how do you hold this position, not just on or off.
Sure.
Get up on it and keep it in the yellow. And if you keep it in the yellow, that's 80%. And then I can get them to really start to feel it.
Sure.
And then when I can feel it, now I can start to teach them how to actually read the sand a bit.
Right.
Because the reading of the sand is probably more difficult than the driving in a lot of ways.
I would agree. And what's interesting about sand, and one of the things that I find so fascinating about it, is you're dealing with flotation, you're dealing with traction, and you're dealing with thrust.
Yeah.
It's the one. Well, you can deal with thrust in mud, but that's fairly unlikely. So if you see a sand rail, this 2-wheel drive sand rail, people are like, how in the world can this thing go so well in the sand? Well, first of all, it's light and it's extremely powerful, and they oftentimes have paddles in the back. So that's where thrust like in a jet engine, we're actually displacing more mass of sand than the weight of the car.
Yeah.
So it's actually thrusting the vehicle forward because of the displacement of the material. Now that's very, very difficult to do in an overland vehicle, especially like in a 70 series, but you're getting some thrust.
Yeah.
As the wheel speed increases, and you'll notice that like very powerful vehicles, that's one of the ways that Land Rover overcomes what I believe to be an inappropriate wheel diameter, is because they have a high horsepower engine. So you end up with a combination of some flotation, because you can air down like a 20-inch wheel, you can air down to 20 psi fairly confidently in the dunes, and it's where I would probably start. And they're not terribly heavy. It's not like you're driving a diesel.
Yeah, they're not 10,000 pounds.
Yeah, they're not a diesel 1 ton or something like that. But they do have fairly high horsepower oftentimes.
Yeah.
So that's where you'll see like a Range Rover Sport, with a supercharged V8 like screaming through the dunes.
Sure.
It's not going slow, but if it's going fast, it tends to keep going.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting how all of those things work in concert. So if your vehicle is a higher horsepower vehicle, then you can take advantage of some of that thrust.
Yeah, the horsepower makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
for sure.
And it does make it more fun, but it also makes the consequences much higher. So I remember being in Peru with the Discovery 5, and the difference between a successful kind of loft over a dune through and one that just absolutely augured in and did a lot of damage, and we had to do a field repair and everything on it, was probably the difference of 10 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And it just resulted in a big jump.
That's a challenge in the dunes, is because we kind of started to hit on it earlier, but people become reactionary, right? And anytime we're reactionary to anything means that things are influencing us to have to react to it. And we want to be the course of action, not the course of the reaction to it. And dunes in particular, because people are so afraid to get stuck, they will, give her hell to get up and over a dune that they may have not even ever seen what's on the other side. Yeah. And
what's on the leeward side?
It's kind of important to know where you're driving, and so like one of the techniques that I teach all the team a lot is that I call it surfing a dune, but basically what we what we do when we work through the dunes is, I get so annoyed when I see just people out on foot with a radio, like trying to find a route through the dunes. I mean, it's fine sometimes, but if it's 130 out, it's kind of inappropriate, actually. Yeah. And a lot of times, if you looked at a GPS sort of track of me driving through the dunes, it would look like a bunch of Olympic rings.
Yeah.
I'm constantly looking up, looking at the top of the dune, and honestly, I can make that decision really quickly if I'm in a good position. Yep, that's a good spot and a good place for me to go. And then I can crest over the dune. I'm never just like sort of perpendicular to the top of the dune, kind of. I see these kind of cars stuck at the top of the dunes, and typically that's because somebody just decided they wanted to go up and over it. We normally want to just break over like we would in any other thing. We're trying to decrease that breakover angle and get to the top. And of course, the nice thing is that you kind of give it some momentum and you just lift a little and start to feel it slow down and kind of ease over the top, and like buying yourself a little time, look for the next safe spot to drive to, drive to it, circle around, come around, look for the next safe spot, and you just coming around. But you gotta, from an expedition standpoint, you have to understand that works really well for the first guy.
Yeah.
If there's 5 of you, the 5th guy's gonna have a much harder time than anybody else.
Disrupted.
It's all torn up. Odds are some people have got stuck by then.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
Well, let's kind of go through what I believe are some of the core principles around sand. Safety is always a concern in sand, both from you've got oftentimes high heat, so the possibility of heat strokes, so really pay attention to hydration. If you're digging vehicles out, really be paying attention to each other. Take a break, get in the air conditioning if you've got it, or at least get into some shade. Yeah. So there's some safety that we want to be paying attention to. The other thing around safety is visibility. There is a possibility, especially in a highly trafficked dune area, that a vehicle could be coming the other direction.
Yep.
And that's another reason why we kind of pause at the top of a dune, or even do like you're talking about, where we take a run along the edge and we take a quick look, so we can see if there's other vehicles off in the distance. So if we have the opportunity to run a flag, we want to run a flag. That can oftentimes be done at the top of an aerial on your antenna. You just slide a flag over the top. Just throw that in your toolkit. It's very easy to do. And then people are going to really see you in the sand dunes a lot easier. The other thing that we want to be paying attention to is our tire pressure. So we want to make sure we air down before we go into the sand dunes, so that way we can maximize our opportunity of getting through. Know where your max tracks are, know where your recovery gear is, because again, it's hot, so we don't want to be spending a bunch of time digging around for that equipment. Or you forgot the lock, combination to the max tracks lock, or the key, you don't have the key. Make sure you got all that stuff before you venture off into the sand dunes. We also need to make sure, Land Rover says this best, we need to be going as slow as possible, but as fast as necessary. We do need to maintain momentum, but we don't want to drive so fast that we start jumping off of dunes, or we get committed to, there's things called witch's eyes. There's long, even troughs of dunes where you think you're set, but you can't even get out of the other end. So we really need to be paying attention to wrecking the terrain as we're driving. I think that's really important. We also want to be really mindful of our driver inputs. One of the things that's interesting in the sand is you'll find that you need to use the brakes very little.
Yes, that's
because
right.
as soon as you throttle lift, you talked about that 60% slope or that resistance. As soon as you throttle lift, the vehicle will start to slow down, and it can even come to a stop on a downslope.
Yeah, correct.
Because there's so much resistance in the sand. So you really want to be careful of that inclination to stab the brakes if something feels wrong. That can result in you immediately being stuck. Even on a downslope, you can get stuck in a vehicle if you stab the brakes too hard, because it just forces you into the sand. So we want to be really gentle around our inputs. So we're going to be feeding throttle. We're going to be maintaining momentum. Think of momentum in the sand as like a savings account. We want to put money in. We want to put momentum in. And then we want to be making draws as we're going up the hill. But we don't want to, at the bottom of the hill, try to put in all of that money right in the bottom of it. We want to be feeding in some momentum. We also have to, with these heavy vehicles, we have to be really, really mindful of our center of gravity. We want to be careful around side slopes. Side slopes are much safer at speed than they are at slow speed, because then you're not you don't tend to slip downslope.
Yep.
So we want to be really, really mindful of that. Those are some of the, for me, some of kind of the basic considerations. Good communications, radios really help to give good communications where you're not stopping and having to communicate. You're able to kind of keep the process moving forward. For me, some of those are some of the kind of the basic or foundational elements. What else would you add to that?
Well, I think a couple things. One is to think about in sand, your steering wheels, your front wheels are really acting more almost like rudders.
Yes.
You're not so much using the traction of the tire to get it to change direction. You're using the sidewalls and inside and outside. So as you start to feed some input into it, really what's happening here is you're putting the sidewall into a liquid. It's pushing up on the sides, and so this is just this sort of fine line of learning that where you're going to get yourself in trouble is you're going to try to give it a big input to go someplace quickly, and it does scrub the speed off really, really quickly, but it also dynamically is really hard on the car. And the obvious one, everybody says don't try to always stop pointed downhill, which is true. I would actually maybe go further and say is that it doesn't necessarily have to be downhill, it just has to be downhill in some direction.
Yeah, sure.
Like if you're going to get stuck, it's likely flatter. If you're really going to get stuck, it's likely going to be someplace where all four of your tires are kind of at the same elevation.
Right. Yeah, because if you fail a climb, you back down.
You
have gravity going.
Exactly. The other thing too is like with sand, I think is that there's probably less kind of driving rules to put around it. Like I hear a lot of trainers say, always use low range. I would say
totally
depending on the sand, it depends like everything else, how much torque you need. And if you need a lot of torque, then you're going to need low range. If you need more horsepower and less torque, you're going to want high range. It is a huge advantage if you have a car that you can go from low to high. Sometimes you need to be in low to get going.
Yep.
And then you can get on a downslope and be going 10 or 15 miles an hour and jam it into high range is a huge advantage.
Like a G-Wagon can do that, a rolling gear change.
Yeah, huge advantage to that. The other things are like...
And the other one too, like goes the other direction, like a Jeep Rubicon. 4-to-1 transfer case is not an advantage in the sand.
No, it's too low,
especially in reverse.
Yeah.
Because at least going forward, you have 8 gears in a modern
but you got
Rubicon.
One in reverse,
you only got one in reverse.
Yeah.
So oftentimes a Wrangler needs to be able to drive, in high range.
Yeah.
It's a Rubicon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like things like that. The other thing is like just understanding the basics of your vehicle's mechanics. Is it have a sitter locking differential?
Yeah.
Is it an open locking differential? If I have lockers, do I want them locked? If I have sway bar disconnect, do I want them locked or unlocked? It's one of the challenges that I find is that everybody kind of just learns that like when I go off road, I'm supposed to push all these things.
Yeah.
And the reality is that we don't want to do that. We want to know when to engage and when to disengage.
Yeah, a front differential lock would never be used in the sand. A rear differential lock would rarely be used in the sand.
Yeah.
Most likely the first thing that you're going to push when you go into the sand is either sand mode, if your car has that.
A mode, yep.
If you have a sand mode, take advantage of that. The car is going to be well suited towards driving in sand. It's going to change the thresholds for vehicle stability control and traction control. It's going to allow for more wheel speed. If you don't have a sand mode, look for the vehicle with the little squiggly line, which is going to be your vehicle stability control button. Yep. In most cases, particularly in the dunes, you're going to need to turn that off. Yeah. Because otherwise it's going to shut you down on throttle as soon as the vehicle starts to yaw or slide a little bit, and then you're really stuck.
Yeah, the thing to remember with dynamic stability control, vehicle stability, is its job is to prevent rollover.
Yeah.
And the way that it mitigates rollover is by trying to make sure that the back tires are in line with the front tires.
Sure.
And the way that it determines that is through wheel speed.
Yeah.
Some cars do use the actual yaw sensors.
Yeah.
But in general, I'd say most cars use wheel speed. So in the sand, if the car's doing something kind of dynamically and rocking around, all four wheels are going to be spinning at a different speed. And at some point, the car will think that it's starting to go into a slide. And when it goes into a slide, the car reacts in two ways. One is that it starts to engage the rear brakes, starts to engage the rear brakes to get that back in line with the front. the number one thing it does is the first thing it does is it starts to pull all the throttle out. It pulls the torque out. And when you turn stability control off, very few cars actually let you truly turn it off.
It just changes the threshold.
It makes it so that it turns that sort of braking component off dramatically.
Yeah.
And it changes it so that the torque doesn't get pulled back near as quickly.
Yeah.
The other thing, since we're talking about it, as I want to mention, is that a lot of the cars we see now are starting to, air suspension is becoming more and more common, not less common. And in sand, it's one of the few places that putting the car in off-road height is a detriment.
Yeah.
It makes the car a lot stiffer, and what we don't want to do is we're trying not to use the suspension to beat the wheels down into the ground.
Yep.
So I always tell people, a normal ride height, you got off-road height if you need it. If you're in a position you need it, use it. But the default mode should be normal. We're trying to make this thing nice and squishy.
Yeah.
And
lower the center of gravity.
Yeah, and just keep it soft and drive it smooth, and use the tools that you got.
And that's actually where those independent front and rear vehicles can really shine.
Absolutely.
They can really be beautiful in the sand. I mean, like you take a Defender 110 in the sand, especially if it's got an 18-inch wheel, that thing's pretty much magic, especially with the bigger motors.
Yeah.
I mean, they rip in the sand.
They're
It's like being in a dune buggy in my mind.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Compared to a Wrangler would eat its lunch in the rocks, but a Wrangler doesn't have a prayer keeping up with a Defender 110 in the sand.
And one of these things with sand modes too is that typically sand modes manufacturers, because they know it's so hard on the cars, one of the things in sand modes is it does everything it can to overcool, so it'll do things like instantly ramp the fan speeds all the way up to full tilt, or if it has like electronically controlled thermostats, it'll open those all the way up. It'll do everything it can to know. You're basically just helping the car know you're about to get used hard.
Are you familiar with any ones that will actually start to taper back on power to keep the vehicle
keep it cool,
or maybe even disconnect the air conditioner? I've seen that before. Yeah,
I mean, typically what you see is manufacturers will start to lose things that they feel like they can lose, which will be things like air conditioner. Air conditioner adds a huge amount of horsepower draw, right?
Yeah.
So
about 8 horsepower, right?
I think it sometimes can be more, particularly if they have dual systems where they have front and rear AC
makes
systems.
A lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense.
It can use quite a lot. So I know that they'll start to pull that out. A lot of times what I typically find is that they will start to detune the transmission.
Yeah, sure.
Automatic. This is talking about automatic, of course, because the torque converter generates so much heat.
Sure.
So they will start to make it so that. And then, of course, you go and start getting into limp home modes.
Yeah, sure.
And the key with limp home in sand, when you get a fault like that, which is not an uncommon thing, is that you let the car just idle. Yeah. And you don't really want to shut it off.
Right.
You just let it idle, and you made great time to go eat lunch.
Yeah.
Let it do its thing, cool itself off a bit, and most of the time, then you can do a key cycle.
Right.
It'll come back to life, and the car's happy again.
Got it.
So,
that's good.
I mean, the car's, we want the car to tell us it's too hot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
so it doesn't blow up.
Right. We want. I get so much, like the check engine light comes on. Yes, thank God.
Yeah.
Right. We want the feedback from the car to tell us that it's seeing something that seems abnormal to it.
Sure.
Even if it's an annoying thing, like something that you plug into a scanner and realize that you can't do anything about.
Yep.
Great, it's good to know. Like something that I did made this go outside of a parameter that somebody spent a lot of time on saying is normal.
That's right.
And if you know what you did, so for instance, if you went out to the dunes and you got a check engine light and a bunch of codes on it, I wouldn't call that a problem.
Yeah.
I would say that great. Now you know that this is what your car does.
Yeah.
It's part of that knowledge base.
Operating a little bit outside of parameters.
Yeah, you're pushing it.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, that's great. Well, that's fun to talk about sand. Let's move on to rocks, and then we'll talk about mud. Rocks are fun, and a lot of people really enjoy rock crawling because it does feel more precise, and it is really a test of the vehicle and the driver kind of overcoming something that looks impossible.
Yeah.
But here's one thing to think about with rock crawling. I kind of wanted to start with this is, it is so tempting to continue to modify a vehicle so that it has an easier time in the rocks. But all that ends up happening is you just go to harder and harder trails.
Yeah, right.
So I think there's some there's a lot of logic around not overbuilding the vehicle, because then it starts to perform poorly everywhere else. So like if you build a vehicle that's going to be masterful in Moab, it's going to be terrible in the dunes. It's going to have terrible fuel economy to drive down the length of Baja. It's going to be really wide where you don't fit in those little colonial villages of Nicaragua. So in my mind, if you enjoy rock crawling, keep the vehicle closer to stock and see how much you can do with it stock. Really challenge yourself and the vehicle, build your spotting skills, learn how to use the vehicle, and really challenge yourself with the vehicle being closer to stock. You'll have more trails available to you, because the harder the trails get, the fewer there are of them out there. The consequences are much higher. Oftentimes you can't use the vehicle as a daily driver. So like, for example, last week I went and did a program with Toyota, and they have very capable vehicles. You know, I was in a TRD Pro, and I was in the Trail Hunter, and I was in the new Land Cruiser. But these are stock vehicles, and we did we did Slaughterhouse Gulch, and we did some fun trails that I was paying attention. Like I was really like water bars, I was really being careful so it wasn't dragging. I had a great time driving a totally stock vehicle on a moderately challenging trail. So I think around the rock crawling thing, unfortunately, I think people are so afraid of getting stuck or their vehicle not performing well that they overbuild them. And as a result, you spend a ton of money, and you've really not learned much as a driver. If you go straight to a Rubicon on 35s, and that's like, you buy that off of I'm not saying that you shouldn't, because that's an awesome car. Like if that's what you start with, you're going to be able to do 99% of the trails out there. But if you start off with a two-wheel drive or something with open diffs where you're left foot braking and you're like, oh, and you're really paying attention to your line, you learn so much more as a driver.
What's interesting, right? If you buy a really capable car, the more built it is, the less precise you have to be as a driver. And so that level, the level of lack of precision allows you to get away with stuff. The flip side of the coin would be is if you learned to drive real precisely and then took a really capable car, now you've got extreme capability.
Now you look like a superhero.
So you know, we see this a lot where I live. You know, you end up somebody who's got really, really capable car, not necessarily that capable as a package. The driver can make it go do things on trails, but it's not really like you could say, hey, let's go try something really tough with it. Now, rocks are an interesting one, because from an engineering side, rocks, well, I guess I should start by two things. One is that, at least from the Land Rover side, which is most of my background on engineering, is that rock crawl mode is not necessarily Moab mode.
Oh yeah, they're different.
And Moab mode, I think, particularly for American brands, is rock mode. And the challenge there is that, you know, on an expedition, rarely would you find yourself in the terrain of Moab, because Moab's pretty unique. Right. But a lot of times what we do find is we find ourselves in the bottom of creek beds, and we find ourselves
baby head rocks.
Exactly.
Loose rocky
climbs. The challenge is right there. Loose is the word. That's the right word, which is that we're in this position to where, or scree fields is another one, right? Now scree fields, the challenge is like things that are sharp. That means we got to be even more precise. But you know, when we talk about rocks, what we're asking the car to do is really has to be our highest level of precision driving, because we have to know exactly where every single corner, every single tire, every single rock, where it is in relation to the car. And the looser it is, the more difficult it is, because that means that when we drive over it, it might move, which means our plan has to change constantly. So this means as a driver, we have to be really precise with our foot, really precise on the brakes, really precise in the steering. We got to have a really good spotter. If you don't have a spotter, we can cheat a little bit with some tech. We can use cameras and things if there exist.
And then you still end up getting out of the car a lot.
You still get out and look, and sometimes you end up stacking rocks too, right? Like we have to do those kinds of things. Now,
and by the way, if you stack rocks on a recreational four-wheel drive trail, unstack them when you come through with your group, so that the next group gets to have
the same fun.
But normally when you're traveling internationally, if you're on a road and you do road repairs, everyone will appreciate your effort. So leave it in place.
Leave it in place. Yeah.
They're just trying to get to the grocery store.
Yeah.
So they'll appreciate whatever road repair you do. But if you're on a recreational trail in America or even in Europe, just put it back the way it was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Now on the Land Rover side, they do a lot of rock testing in a rock quarry in Wales, where most of that gets really kind of tried and true. And then they use Moab for durability testing because it has such a high traction content. And of course, when you make a mistake there, it's really obvious because everything there is painful to the car and people, right? It's like solid asphalt.
Right.
Plus, I don't know how much more traction there is.
Extremely high traction.
So when we talk about, things like Moab, the reason we're precise is because we don't want to damage the car. And then that means slow and steady, and we can do things with cars there that you can't do in the real world. There's a lot because of the traction levels. And sometimes I think when I see people who go to Moab a lot and then I take them someplace that's rock but not Moab, it becomes a challenge.
They struggle.
They expect the traction level to be there.
Sure.
It's not there. So,
and I think that's why it's nice that Jeep still uses the Rubicon for a lot of testing.
Absolutely.
Because you end up with high traction shelves like granite, but then you end up with loose rocks, big rocks.
Yeah. Rubicon's a great example. I mean, that's a great rock crawl trail.
It is.
And it's totally
super
not
fun.
Moab, right?
No, it's super fun.
And if you get a little rain on it, all of a sudden your high traction rock becomes extremely low traction, almost like ice.
Right.
And so it's challenging and it's a really good example of rock.
Yeah, for sure. So rock crawling, in my mind, you're going to want to default again towards we're going to air the tires down. The reason we're not looking for flotation anymore because we're typically going to be on a hard surface. There could be mud and sand interspersed between rocks, but the reason why we're airing down in the rocks is for mechanical keying and carcass deformation. So it's just like when a rock climber is climbing up the side of a mountain, we want our hand to be able to wrap around whatever available surfaces in the rock so we can pull ourselves up the mountain. The same thing is true of the vehicle. We want that carcass to begin to deform around the rock, which will put more of the carcass in contact with the rock, which ramps up the available adhesion. So that's the rubber to rock adhesion, which is, there's many factors of that, including compound. But then the other thing that we're looking for is mechanical keying. So that's where we're going to be keying the lugs of the tire to the surface irregularities of the rock.
Yeah.
So it's literally like a hand coming around a boulder as you're hauling yourself up a mountain. So like a mud tire can oftentimes be very effective in the rocks because of that mechanical keying. Whereas an all-terrain is probably going to be better in Moab because there's not as much mechanical keying. There's just a lot of traction, a lot of friction and traction. So we want to make sure we're airing down the vehicle. We want to make sure that we know what our low points are in the vehicle. And we want to make sure that we have a spotter or at least we have some tools available to us to help us navigate the terrain safely. We really want to slow everything down. It's very rare, unless you're watching something happening in Johnson Valley, that you're going to be introducing a lot of speed to rock crawling because the consequences and the risks to the vehicle go up exponentially. Normally, when you need to solve a problem with speed, you're far better off pulling winch line if you've got a winch and still keep everything slow.
Yeah.
Take it back to slow. And one of the reasons why we drive slow in the rocks is that our vehicles are suspended. So they're on airbags or they're on coil springs. And when you're driving through the rocks, the more that we get that suspension cycling, we're actually losing ground clearance.
Correct.
So one of the reasons why we go slow through the terrain is we want to keep the vehicle as high as possible so that we're not making body to rock contact or transfer case to rock contact or, heaven forbid, transmission to rock contact.
Right.
So we're really going to slow things down, and that's going to keep the vehicle and us safe.
Yeah. It's funny, I was just thinking about it. One of the things I really tell people is that a lot of this stuff we can simplify.
Yeah.
Which is that if you just got out of a car and you had to walk the same exact terrain, like what would you do differently, or what shoes would you wear differently?
Yeah, sure.
Or like in rock's a great example, right? So if we
walking speed.
If we were going to get out of a creek bed, would we sprint?
Yeah.
Would I stand and not bend my knees? Would I change my center of gravity? Would it be lower? Would I want it higher? Would I separate my feet? Would I make sure my hands, so in case, like, would I know where the rocks are?
That's right.
Would I maybe check a rock before I stepped on it to see if it moves? And actually, it pretty much translates to everything. Same with the sand, like if you tried to walk really slowly in the sand, you would find that you would sink in.
Yeah.
Or if you just walked a little bit quicker, you'll notice that you'll stay on top of it.
Sure.
You'll notice that you're going to work a lot harder climbing a sand dune than you are going to come down it.
For sure.
And if snow and ice is the same, right? When we get into snow and ice, which a lot of people have more experience with because we drive in snow and ice on well, not everybody, but a lot of people do in normal day-to-day lives. But, when you get in snow and ice, you stab the brakes really hard. Like you're smoother on the brakes, you're smoother on the wheel, you're real soft on the throttle pedal. You're ready for it to slide because you've learned.
You're being vigilant.
Yeah, and that's
really you end up in a ditch.
Yeah,
that's how I learned a lot. I ended up in a lot of ditches.
Yeah, you go like that was a little too much, right? Yeah. So I think one takeaway for people is like a lot of the sort of inherent skills, if you drive someplace often, and particularly if you live someplace that has a lot of different kinds of conditions, weather conditions and stuff, you probably inherently have the skill set to do it well.
Yeah.
It's not as hard as you want it to make it to be. It's just that people don't equate like what they feel in their feet to what the tire sees, but it's actually pretty much the same surface, right?
And I remember you mentioning that when we were doing the A&E program with Land Rover. You talked to the other drivers about walking speed, and I think that was a really good example of when you're walking through the rocks, you are going slower. You're really paying attention to where you're putting your feet, and the same thing applies to the vehicle. So we need to keep the speed low. Again, this is not recreational four-wheeling we're talking about, so it's a very important distinction. We're talking about preserving this vehicle, going through this creek bed filled with boulders because we're trying to get to this cool mission.
Yeah.
So we have a place to go and we have a ferry to catch and everything else like that. So we're going to slow everything down. But it really is important to slow it down. I think.
Yeah, because, right, I mean, if you talk to guys in the military, right, it's all about moving through things, identifying things, being efficient with the time and not making mistakes. And that's how you do it quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
And efficiency comes from building mental roadmaps, looking ahead, understanding what the next steps are, moving through it. It's when we don't do that and then we spend 20 minutes or a half hour or an hour changing the tire, or we find out that our tire was flat because our spare tire is flat. You know how many times I've seen that?
Yeah, that happens.
So like, this is what this whole talk's about, is like preparation, mental preparation, physical preparation.
Having a plan when you're going through stuff.
Yeah.
So what are some other things about rocks? I mean, one of the things that, and we'll kind of maybe riff back and forth on it, but know what capabilities your vehicle has. So what I find is when you're on a maintained road, you're probably going to, a maintained dirt road, you're going to probably be in four-wheel drive. And then when you're on a secondary road and you're just feeling yourself very relaxed and you're not really even needing to pay that close of attention, you're still going to probably be in high range four-wheel drive. But what I notice is, like, anytime the grade starts to change or it changes to a two-track, for example, from a maintained road, then we're going to want to consider going down into low range.
Yep.
So that's a good prompt to go into low range because we want to preemptively be ready, because things may be flat and seem fine, but then you go into a ditch and next thing you know, you need that compounding gear to get up the slope on the other side, or you need to use some compression braking to get down. So we want to go into low range. And then this is what I find is a good prompt for like rock mode or rear locking differential. If you stop the car and you're really studying what you're about to climb and you're thinking, that looks pretty challenging, it's probably a good idea to either go into rock crawl mode, which may or may not lock a rear differential, but it will at least more actively do wheel slip intervention. Or if you have a rear locker, go ahead and lock that rear. Now, the reason why most vehicles come with only a rear locking differential is because lockers are most needed when you're climbing.
Yep.
And when we're climbing, where does all the weight go?
Yeah, it goes to
the rear axle. That's the reason why they don't come with just a front locker. There's other reasons too, but more and more though, we're finding vehicles with front and rear lockers. So if you're stopping and you're looking at a trail and you're like, I need a spotter and I don't know, like this looks really tough and you got to get through there, and it's straight up and down, that's when maybe you want to consider engaging a front locker.
Yeah.
But usually I save the front locker until I really, really need it. And you definitely don't want to have a front locker on when you're going in really tight steering situations, because you end up with a lot of understeer once you lock that front diff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think people don't realize how much strain a locker creates.
Yeah.
I mean, it gives you a lot of extra traction, but that as the balance of that is that you're putting a lot of mechanical strain onto things, and
a lot of driveline bind.
And particularly like typically with a locker is that in high traction surfaces, I was almost going to say they're less effective, but you're putting more strain on it. It's not that the effectiveness changes; it's that the
effectiveness goes up, but the risk goes up.
The risk goes up, yeah. So in a low traction environment, you can kind of be an idiot with lockers because it's not going to probably create a whole lot of mechanical problems. Right. But in a high traction surface, you're going to have a lot of potential breakage.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was actually, I think it was in Panama, and another vehicle was with us, and they just forgot to take the vehicle out of four-wheel drive. They pulled onto the road and blew a CV.
Yeah.
High traction, right, and a little bit of power. They weren't being reckless.
Yeah.
They just forgot to take the car out of four-wheel drive, popped a CV. So those high traction conditions, especially with lockers, can really. It also happened in Greenland. Front differential was locked on a Hilux, and they forgot that it was locked, and they made a tight turn and blew the CV because running at 2-3 psi, even on snow, incredible amount of traction. So we really want to be careful when we're engaging the front locker. It's something that we're going to only do I use it just to clear an obstacle.
Yeah.
Like the rear's spinning and the car's starting to slide, and I know that the front locker is the solution. Engage the front locker, get through the obstacle, turn it back off again. Yeah. So we get full steering control. The front differential is also going to be your weakest, not the differential, but your CVs or your constant velocity joints or your Burfields. Once you start to turn them, when they're in a straight line, they're very strong, but once you start to turn them, you're rapidly losing contact in the cage. So you're going to have a weaker CV when you're in full lock, or even full droop. So IFS when you're in full droop or full compression, it's the same angle. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. So we want to be really, really careful about engaging a front locker, using it selectively, which they would be a selective front locker, and only when we absolutely need to.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're spinning, I mean, it's a good time to engage.
Yeah, good time to engage.
It's better for the trail too.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We're using four-wheel drive to reduce trail damage. We're engaging rear locking differentials to reduce trail damage. We're airing down the tires to reduce trail damage. So I think a good rule also for rocks is I like using the wheel diameter for air pressure as a starting point. If you have a 17-inch wheel, go to 17 psi.
Yep.
Now this depends on the vehicle. If it's a very, very heavy vehicle, that may not be the case.
Yeah.
But in general, if you have an 18-inch wheel, go down to 18 psi. If you got a 22-inch wheel, go to 22 psi.
Yeah.
We don't really want to go much lower than that, because then we have the challenges of wheel damage, and we have the challenge of the bead coming off of the wheel, getting a flat. What are some other kind of important tips that you use around rock climbing?
Yeah, rock. I think rock is the one place where having a really good, well-made tire really shines.
Yeah.
Because of the sidewalls.
Yeah.
Having a really good, strong sidewall tire makes a huge difference. I mean, again, that's back to the sidewall, is like, because the sidewall is so, it's the thing that's going to most likely have a problem or a puncture.
Yeah, sure.
Means that we're typically not thinking about sidewalls so much, but in rocks we have to primarily think about sidewalls, which also means that if there's something sharp, we want to drive over it, not around it. We want to start.
Yeah, the face of the tire has significantly. You could have 8-10 plies.
Yeah, rarely.
The sidewall, you're lucky if it's got 2 or 3.
2 or 3. Yeah, rarely do you ever find a flat or a tear where there's tread.
Yeah,
it's almost always in the sidewall.
Right.
And that compounds with speed. So the thing to remember is that, again, when we go slow and we drive over things, we're being nice to our car.
Mm-hmm.
When we have, if I remember this right, it's like if you take mass and speed, it's exponential, right? It's the square root of.
Yeah.
which means like if we go twice as fast, it's 4 times as much energy that's transferred into the object. So like if we think about that from a rock standpoint, if we have a really sharp rock and we present that to the tire and we're just going 4 miles an hour instead of 2 miles an hour, it's 4 times the amount of pressure that's being exerted on that tire. Yep. So that means we have to be really conscientious about where those sidewalls are, which again, having a good tire makes a huge difference. And it's not just having a good tire, it's having a good tire that's designed for sidewall protection.
Right.
And I always like to talk about Duratrax.
Yeah, because there's commercial tires that are super strong, but they're not going to work well on the rocks.
Yeah, I mean, I have Goodyear Duratrax, and they're great tires. And the reason I like them is they're like a good sort of, I'd say a slight step above an all-terrain.
Right.
They're not, Goodyear might describe them as a mud terrain. I would describe them as
a hybrid tire.
Kind of a marginal mud terrain tire. Sure. They're very good in the snow for what they are.
A lot of siping.
But the sidewalls are not, they're soft.
Yeah.
They're compliant. They're a very nice compliant sidewall. And for me, in the way I use my car, that makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
But if I were going to go to some place that had days and days and days of sharp rocks, it would be the first thing I would change.
Yep.
And now they make a Duratrax that has a better sidewall. I mean, so it's not,
No, you're right.
Goodyear comes up and says, oh, yeah, okay, right. But, we have Goodyears have always had really good sidewalls.
Yep.
And it's becoming more and more common. Tires are getting better.
Yeah, Nittos have really strong sidewalls.
Yeah, and that's really, like...
Or think of the XCLs I have on the Defender.
There's a...
I can't remember seeing an XCL flat.
No, well, it's because they might be flat. You wouldn't know it because the
sidewall... They don't work in a lot of others. I'm not trying to advocate for an XCL, but when it comes to puncture resistance, they're pretty good.
Yeah,
they're pretty good.
I think they have 10-ply sidewalls.
Yeah, yeah. I wouldn't doubt it at all. Yeah, rocks are a lot of fun. It's a dance, whereas like snow is a chess match, and sand is an e-ticket ride at Disneyland.
Yeah.
Rocks are definitely a dance, and it's a dance between you and your spotter and the vehicle. So you got 3 people involved with it, and everybody needs to be communicating. We need to be communicating to the car as smoothly as possible. I mean, you think about if you're going to ask somebody to dance, you're not going to just
start throwing them around.
Your inputs are going to be smooth. You're going to want to be cool. You want to be collected.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to a car very much. And your feet are moving constantly. And this is where it comes to the point we want to talk about left foot braking.
Oh yeah.
So the nice thing about left foot braking in the rocks, and I use left foot braking in all terrain and all driving conditions. I drive with my left foot because I've done it for so long. Left foot braking allows us to put the driveline under tension.
Yep.
So we're going to apply some brake and apply a little bit of throttle. We're going to actually modulate our speed as much with the brake as we are with the throttle, and we're kind of dancing between threshold on both of those to move the vehicle through the obstacle. But the one thing I really like about it is you don't have that delay when you're coming up on a rock. You're feeding throttle and you get to the top of the rock and there's still a little bit of throttle being fed, but now you got to make that transition from the throttle to the brake, and there's a delay in there that allows the vehicle to come off the backside of the rock and slam down, and next thing you know, you got a big dent in your quarter panel. Whereas if you kept some brake pressure on there and you're kind of playing between those 2 thresholds, then you've always got some drag on the brakes, which is going to help us come down off the rock smoothly. And we're going to be more responsive to our spotters' inputs. But there's this interesting, especially even in an open differential, in an open diff vehicle, having some left foot braking, because of the brake drag, it's actually going to improve our traction too. The vehicle's going to be less likely to spin a wheel. Yeah. It's all under tension.
Well, I mean, it really, like, left foot braking is it's probably one of the most difficult skills to get.
Yeah.
Because you're asking, particularly these days, because so many people can't drive a clutch. Because really the muscle memory is very similar to learning how to modulate a clutch.
Totally.
Right? And so when you're trying to explain to people that you're trying to apply the brake and the gas at the same time, but if it's a little too much brake, then you can ease off that a little. But if you start to feel that you don't have enough torque, then you're going to have to get a little more gas, right? I mean, you're constantly almost doing this. You're fighting in a way. And of course, one of the challenges these days is that a lot of manufacturers don't let you do it. That the car goes into sort of...
That's a quick way to know that you don't want to buy a car from that manufacturer. If they defeat traction control or they cut throttle under left foot braking and you're in an off-road, if you're in low range,
it should work.
And the car is cutting throttle or defeating traction control, buy a different car. Because it just means that the manufacturer doesn't understand one of the most fundamental principles of driving off-road. And there are manufacturers where that happens. A lot of them have fixed it because I've been very vocal about that. But a Land Rover will work under left foot braking. A Toyota now will work under left foot braking if you're in an appropriate off-road mode like low range or something like that. Of course, the Grenadier works as it should. But you want to make sure that you can left foot brake because it's so critical to avoiding body damage, being smooth over the terrain, and reducing trail damage.
Yeah, and the left foot brake, I grew up driving that old 60s series truck, and
that'll teach you a lot.
So basically no horsepower, lots of feedback from everything. If you do it wrong, instantly because you're either stuck or injured. Everything inside the car is really sharp too. So if you're not really smooth on things, like you physically you get punished for it.
That's the truth.
But the other part of it is that like a good example is because there's no articulation. A lot of times in that car there is a wheel in the air. A lot of times you're kind of constantly, you're not articulating. You're like a buckboard wagon. So a wheel's in the air, which means that my entire axle is trying to send power to the wheel that's got no traction. It's
so true.
It's not touching anything. So if you don't know how to left foot brake, you're never going to get through it. You're literally stuck. So what most people do is then they back up and go faster, right? So they start to add momentum to try to just allow the car to fly over something. When you left foot brake it, all of a sudden now wheel comes off the ground. You're starting to realize what's happening. My wheel's off the ground. Okay, I start to apply some brake on the left, which means I also got to give it a little more gas because I'm fighting myself now. Give myself a little more gas. Now all I'm doing really is I'm just applying the brake to the point where that wheel starts to lock up, right? And I'm starting to slow down with the brake. And as soon as that happens, I start to move. And now I'm moving, now I can let off the brake a little bit so that when I hit, I know I can let the wheel roll. And you drive through it and people are like, wow, it's amazing. And it's really it's basically brake operated traction control, right?
Absolutely.
And
that's exactly what it is.
If we look at the tech, left foot braking is one of the things that a manufacturer would love to be able to duplicate. And they do sort of do that, and what they do
some
are
of the crawl
controls and all-terrain progress controls. That's really what it's trying. Everybody marketing calls it like an off-road cruise control. It's really not. What it's trying to do is it's trying to control exactly the scenario that you were talking about. It can actually do it better than us because it can do it wheel by wheel.
That's right. We can only put one input.
That's it. So it's like if we had 4 gas pedals and 4 brake pedals and lots of legs, and to be able to push all those things. But it can literally try to apply torque as one wheel is climbing a rock. But if the left front wheel's coming down the rock, it's applying brake on that to slow it down.
That's right.
Gives us a little more control.
One thing that the car doesn't know, though, is what's coming up next.
Correct.
And that's what the driver does know. And that's why the driver can oftentimes be superior than that technology.
Absolutely.
Eventually, the cameras will have AI and algorithms, and it'll remember the rock, and it'll know how far it moved, and it'll know when the rock is there. I have no doubt that that'll eventually happen. But the left foot braking, I believe, is a really important skill that people can learn. And one of the best places to practice that is if you just go to a parking lot that has basically parking curbs. So those little kind of semi-triangular parking curbs, they're usually low enough where they're not going to hit anything.
Oh yeah, the little
concrete stops, and you can sometimes you can find it where there's one, and then a couple feet later there's another one. So you can we can mall crawl, but it's a great place to learn that left foot braking, to climb up on that stop, come down. That way, if you hit it a little hard, nothing's going to happen. If you come down a little fast, nothing's going to happen. And start getting to where you can be super smooth going up and over a curb or over one of those parking stops and down the other side. Those are places that we can practice those inputs, or on a local trail that's fairly easy with small rocks. We can really get some precision around left foot braking.
Yeah, and it's good to practice. I mean, you're right; those stops are great.
And then we actually use big wheel chocks, and when we used to do training for the military, and we would put them in different positions so that the driver had to remember where they were placed and put the tire on top of those.
Specific tire on top of
and then
a certain spot.
win an extra piece of pizza or something like that.
Yeah.
But, it's a good challenge. Those are good little obstacles that we can set up to get more comfortable with not only where our wheel is, where we're moving towards, but also controlling the vehicle up and over the rock.
Yeah.
Overall, I think rocks are a lot of fun. It's something that people tend to like to do.
Yeah.
I think rock crawling has also become very popular, and the vehicles like a Rubicon Wrangler, incredibly well suited to the task.
Yeah.
And they're amazing how they perform in those conditions. But let's learn which buttons to push. Let's learn how to also operate the vehicle. Like, what if the rear locker stops working?
Yeah.
That's another example when learning left foot braking can really make a big difference. Knowing that you're in the right mode as well. Let's make sure we air down. Let's make sure we're being mindful of our tires. Get a spotter out sooner than you think you need to. Pull a winch cable sooner than you think you need to. Because again, we're trying to preserve our overland vehicles for the rest of the adventure. Somebody may be on a year-long trip. Like, we have to preserve that vehicle for another 8-9 months.
Yeah.
So let's slow it all down. Let's take fewer risks, but still have fun with it. Still enjoy it. Absolutely.
I also wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of you for listening to the Overland Journal Podcast. By listening to this podcast and subscribing to the Overland Journal magazine, you're supporting our employee-owned and veteran-owned business. Impartial reviews and in-depth content like this would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy the podcast, I think you'd really love the print magazine as well. And 100% of that subscription price goes back into creating the content like you're listening to right now. And as a special thank you for your loyalty, we're giving 20% off any subscription. And that even includes our special lifetime subscription, which includes numerous lifetime-only benefits. You can go to overlandjournal.com and use the code OverlandPodcast at checkout. Again, that's code OverlandPodcast at checkout, and that'll give you 20% off. I sincerely appreciate your support.
All right, so let's talk about mud. Some people love mud. In fact, I find people either absolutely love mud or they absolutely hate mud. In fact, I think there's a whole website for Land Cruisers that's called I Hate Mud.
I hate mud,
so
yeah.
Woody, kudos to Woody, because Woody wants to be in Moab, wants to be on rocks. He does hate mud. I find that I'm somewhere in between. I try to avoid it because it can be very caustic to the vehicle. It can be very difficult to clean. You don't want to leave mud on your car. It can obscure inspections and all that other stuff.
Yep.
But sometimes you're in it, and when you're in it and you're in it for days, it can be a lot of fun.
Yep.
To do that, it reminds you of the Camel Trophy,
Yeah.
You start singing the Saba Malaysia song in your mind. I don't know why I still know that song. I've dated myself and yeah.
Oh well.
It's all good. But mud is a lot of fun, and it's also very hard on the vehicle. So there's some techniques that we want to use. So what are some of your kind of fundamentals for mud driving?
Well, let's start with a couple things before we get into the driving part, which is mud is, again, a very dynamic surface. And one of the challenges with mud is mud's really different in different places.
Yeah.
Some of the worst mud I've ever had is in Moab, right? Because it doesn't rain there.
No.
And when it does rain there, then the mud is really silt.
Yeah.
And it's bottomless until it dries, and then you just drive out of it.
Yeah.
Or you get a layer of mud, 4-inch layer of mud, and then that whole thing sort of breaks off in sheets.
Yeah.
Versus like if we go down to the Carolinas, and you go down into the clay, down to Uwharrie or something, where you got a lot of clay and the mud is a little more slimy. It also has a lot of, I would call it suction. Yeah. It's almost like a, kind of.
Oh, for sure.
It's like, there's like an adhesion there.
Yeah, sure.
And so, again, all these kind of things. Now, the good news is that most of the time when you go to these places, you can tell by other people's cars who are locals.
Yeah.
What the conditions and what kind of mud there is by the way their cars are built.
Yeah,
I mean, you go someplace and you see cars with really tall, skinny, super swampers.
You see that in Alaska.
Something with huge knobby tires. You instantly go like, okay, the mud here is deep, it's endless, and it's people have to cut their fenders out and stuff because there's so much mud that sticks to the tires that go around that They probably have cut them because they've been torn off at some point.
Mm-hmm. Whereas if the mud has a lot of sand in it, you can even get away with a mild mud terrain.
Correct.
Because the mud will fling out of the lugs more easily.
Right.
If there's a higher moisture content, a lot of times you can evacuate the mud more easily. Yeah, you're right. It varies so significantly. But a lot of the same rules apply. We want to air down our tires.
Yeah, so again, if we can spread the pressure around a little bit so we can get a little bigger footprint, we can use horsepower to our advantage, because what we're trying to do then is essentially if we look at a mud terrain tire, and mud terrain tire is best the day it was bought. Yeah, when those lugs are really got these nice 90-degree edges on them. Because what it's doing is at that point it is acting like that shovel, like we talked about the sand rail. Yeah. It's taking the mud, it's moving it to another place. But that also means that we now need to have enough horsepower to be able to displace that, whatever that weight is.
That's right.
And actually then move the car forward in it. Now in the old days when we had less horsepower, we would go with a little taller, skinnier tire with the hopes that we would dig down to where the mud had more traction and less looseness.
Right.
And if you're in those conditions, it's great. And I'm still a firm believer that a nice, tall, skinny tire has a ton of advantages.
Sure.
But what we want to do is we want to remember things like if all the wheels are spinning, it indicates that we don't have a lot of traction. Now, we might be moving and we might be flinging mud, in which case that's why it's moving. So that's one of these times where you just sort of leave it where it's at and let it do its thing. Small steering inputs, again.
That helps.
When
being active with the steering wheel in the mud is very helpful.
Now, the interesting thing is...
It's not much, though. It's like, 5-10 degrees, maybe?
And what's happening there, actually, the physics of that's really quite interesting, because what we're doing there is we're presenting the sidewall to the tire to the essentially the trough of the mud, right? So the edge is a little bit. Yeah. But what's really happening there is that as we turn the wheel, the power is being sent up through the front diff. And as we turn the wheel, we're transitioning power to the outside and to the inside.
A little torque steer in there.
Yeah, and what we're doing there is every time we get that position to where that power has to go from the outside to the inside, means that for a split second, we have like a locking diff. Yeah. We have power equalized to the front wheels. So when we call it milking the wheel, it's kind of like milking a cow, right?
Yeah, sure.
But kind of milking the wheel,
sawing it back and forth,
and you're kind of going at it. What's actually happening is that power is getting transitioned from front side to side.
Sure.
And every time it splits through the middle, we have really same as a front
almost.
locker.
Yeah.
And so the faster we can do that, gives us that little thing. And a lot of times you'll find as you're starting to get stuck and you start to saw on it, that just that little, it just takes a split second.
Yep.
4 or 5, and then you start to feel it move, and it goes in. Now, the reality is if you had a front locker and you also sawed it a little bit, it would be super effective, because then at that point all you're really doing is you're clearing a space for the tire.
You're wiping some mud away from the front.
Yeah.
You're biting into the sides of the rut a little bit, and that can oftentimes be enough to give you some forward progress. There are some dangers in the mud. There's a lot of things that you don't see.
Can't see. Yep.
That's right. So there can be rocks, and so it's tempting to say, I'm going to solve this problem with speed. I'm not going to get stuck. Well, just know that you're assuming the risk that there's not a log in the rut. There's not a log under the water. There's not, a big rock in there. There's not a very, very deep hole.
Yep. Or
that one of the sides of the trail is 4 feet deep and the other side is 2 feet deep, and you have a chance of a rollover. So it's, again, as slow as possible, but as fast as necessary. We don't want to just solve every problem in mud with speed.
Yeah, and don't drive into it if you're not willing to get out if you get stuck.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another thing I see that drives me crazy, is that guys will drive into stuff and they have absolutely no intention or plan on what they do if they don't come out the other side.
That's right.
You got to be able to get out. And to be fair, that's kind of part of the physical fitness, is like, if you drive into a giant mud hole and the only way to get out of the car is through the window, and you can't fit through the window, you're probably not a great place for you to go. Or you better have some friends there.
Maybe don't make that decision, or make sure you have friends along with you.
Yeah.
Or until they come up with the the shooting winch line.
Yeah, that'd be like Batman.
Like Batman, exactly.
Yeah, get pulled out. That's a great idea. You should. I bet you could sell that here at Overland
At
Expo.
Overland Expo, yeah, I'd sell 1,000 of them. The grappling hook mod.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think mud is a lot of fun. Like once I'm always hesitant to get in it, but once I get in the mud and I'm driving in it, it is a lot of fun. The images are always fantastic.
Yeah.
The experience is fantastic. I remember spending days and days in the mud in Guatemala trying to get to this very remote Mayan ruin of Homol. And I mean, we were, it was, chainsaws and winching and shovels and machetes and days and days and days in the mud and in the jungle. And it's one of my fondest memories of my life. But you really do have to come prepared, and you have to be prepared to be stuck.
Yeah. And in the mud, like as far as gaining traction, I guess from a driving standpoint, it's again not wanting to give it too much throttle.
Yep.
Stability control, you can shut off there. Same thing as you can.
Sometimes there's a mud mode.
Get into if there's a mode, typically that will detune stability control dramatically. If there's ruts, you got to stay in the ruts.
Yeah.
Now the challenge with that sometimes is that the ruts can be very, very deep. But what
You'll
I see
end up in
is
the rut eventually, anyways.
Yeah. Well, the thing that people forget about ruts is that most of the time ruts give us more traction. One is you got to remember when you're in the rut, it's like when you drive into a car wash.
Yeah.
You don't try to drive out of the rut. You got to know that your wheel's straight.
Yep.
You're going to turn your wheel and it keeps going straight. It's not straight.
Yeah.
You got to keep it straight.
That's such a good example. That's probably one of the most common new driver mistakes in the mud is that you'll see them and the tires will be parked sideways as they're trying to go through the rut. Know that your wheels are straight. Many vehicles have a graphic that'll show the angle of the wheel. If not, the logo on the wheel is a good idea, unless you're more than one rotation, which can happen.
Yeah.
But you and mud doesn't typically require that much steering input. They're smaller inputs. So you don't want to go one full revolution in most cases in the mud. If you're in a rut, a rear locking differential is a good idea. A front locking differential is usually not necessary. It can create some issues with you turning in the mud. Once you get on a side slope in the mud, especially if it isn't rutted, you really want to be careful with either locker because it can result in a lot of downslope sliding.
Yeah.
You're more likely to slide downslope or slide off of your line if you have a rear locker on, or even especially a front locking differential on in the mud. So you have to be very mindful of, am I going to slide off the line? Am I going to slide downslope into that ditch? Those are times when you don't want to necessarily put the locking differential on. And as you're driving through this terrain, you want to be thinking of, if I slide, where am I going to end up?
Yep.
Because there's a really good chance you might slide and end up there. So oftentimes I'll pick a line that ends up resulting in me sliding into a safer position than into maybe a rock into my door panel or a tree through my windscreen.
Yeah. People are so scared of the ruts that they do bad decisions to try to stay out of them. When the reality is that the ruts will allow the car to do things. It's being held, and the tire has traction on a greater surface because the rut is encompassing not just the bottom but the outside of the tire.
Right.
Now the thing is that when we get into mud, is that we also, again, like sand, have to make sure that we're prepared. So if we get stuck, like having shovels, and max tracks can be really helpful.
Super helpful. Yeah.
Traction boards. But airing down does make a really big difference.
Make sure your winch works. Make sure
you got the stuff.
I mean, and that you have an extension in there. Oftentimes, I mean, the longest I was ever stuck was 14 hours on the canning stock route in Australia. And we've used every single piece of recovery gear we had in all three trucks. Three trucks. And it took all of it because one winch broke, one line broke. I mean, it was just that thick clay, very, very deep conditions, a lot of stiction, a lot of resistance, a lot of digging, we used 12 max tracks to get out. So
built a road.
Yeah, we built a road. So make sure that you have the equipment that you need going into the terrain that you're traveling in. Because it can be very, very difficult.
Yeah, so, and use low range.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I find challenging with low range is that people feel like low range means first gear low range.
Yeah.
And I rarely am in first gear low range.
Yeah.
I am in the mud probably in third or fourth gear low range most of the time. I mean, usually depending on how many gears your transmission has, but you know, in most cars, third gear low range is about the same as first gear high range.
That's right.
And so if you're in sort of third gear low range, and if you need a little extra torque, you can always bump it into second. And if you're finding that the wheels are spinning, you want to upshift, not downshift.
Yeah.
And I see that mistake a lot too, where I'm losing traction, but no, you're not moving the way you want to, but you don't need torque to do it. You need less torque to do it.
You need wheel speed.
Yeah.
In mud, oftentimes, so we can evacuate the mud, and we can get that clean biting edge back into the mud again.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times you can overgear yourself. So then you're really high in the RPM range. You're adding a lot of strain to the motor, and you actually don't have as much headroom as you think you do. Whereas to your point, if you upshift in the next higher gear, you have a much higher RPM headroom to add some additional throttle, get some additional wheel speed, clear out some mud, and then back it back off again. So that you can, and when you start moving forward again, you can back it back off. When you start slowing down, feed it a little bit of throttle, so you start to clear out some mud, and then you'll get going again. But it's really, like everything else, it is a dance, and sometimes you'll find that backing way off will get you to come up on top again.
On top of it,
You just don't know until you start playing around with it. And to your point, it's so regionally specific.
Yep.
So,
and the mud. One thing to remember with mud is that, as fun as mud is, it is the one time that we really need to make sure afterwards that we get the car really clean.
Yeah.
It is really hard on the car to have all that mud caked into stuff.
All that weight.
And it's a pain in the neck to do. It is not fun to go to a car wash and get on your hands and knees and clean the bottom of the car, but you really got to do it, and you'll appreciate it. Yeah. Especially 10 years down the road, because a lot of times mud is very caustic in places and has a lot of acids in it and stuff, and it's
chemicals, alkalis.
I mean, you look at online right now, right? There's all these tools to clean out the inside of your chassis and chassis sprayers, and it's for people driving in salt water and stuff like that.
Take the time to do it.
It's the same problem, So
and the wheels can get out of balance. It can do a lot of damage. So and all that extra weight is going to affect acceleration, stopping, vehicle handling. You can easily add 500-600 pounds of mud, depending on the situation, to the vehicle. So you really want to make sure that you're cleaning it out properly at the end of it. But have fun in mud. Yeah. Don't use speed to solve every mud problem.
Yep.
You use speed when you absolutely have to, but make sure, to your point, that if you do get stuck, that you have the tools and the capabilities to get yourself out.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been fun, man. We could have gone on for another couple hours, I think. So, the goal around this podcast was to provide a primer around driving off-road, driving off-highway, driving in the backcountry while you're overlanding. Look for a local trainer, look for a local club, find some experienced overlanders that you can go out and travel with and learn some skills about four-wheel driving. But be prepared ahead of time, make sure the vehicle's in good shape, as slow as possible, as fast as necessary. I still am a real big believer in Land Rover's philosophy around that. Get your spotter trained, get your co-driver trained. Enjoy what you're doing, have fun with it, but remember, you got to make it to the end of the trip. So, take as much risk out of the equation as you can.
Invest in training, because the training will stay with you no matter how many cars you buy. You spend some time, spend some effort, learn this stuff, get some skill set under you'll get the base training, which will facilitate you into doing bigger and better stuff on your own.
Yeah.
And then
it allows you to pay that forward to other people, other travelers.
Absolutely.
The number of times that I see an experienced backcountry driver be able to stop and help a bystander that's stuck. They followed Google with their rental car.
Yeah, right.
You can really help people with those skills too. So
real transferable.
Sean, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll make sure that we expand on these topics in the future. It's always a joy to have you on the podcast. You're a wealth of information, and you're such an important member of the community. And how do people follow you? How do they find out more information about what you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, my business website is my business is Sea to Summit Experiences, S2SX, so S the number 2 S X like X-ray, S2SX.com, and see what I'm up to, and it has links to my Instagram and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's probably the easiest way. I'm not super social, but yeah.
That's probably a good idea. All right, thank you, Sean. We appreciate it. We
Pleasure.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.